Welcome. I am Subodh Pandit, a medical doctor with a specialty in internal medicine. I was born and brought up in India and then came and lived in the United States. Apart from my career, I would constantly think of things that people would grapple and wrestle and converse about and not come to any real conclusion. I wondered why, so I began to look into it, and my intellectual journey went on for years and even decades. So what I'm going to do now is share some of that with you, and we're going to do it over 13 periods and sessions. I hope that you will stay with me the whole way. Look at the topic we're going to discuss today: God, fact or fiction? Huge, as well as controversial. And in fact, if you go into it, one question will lead to another and yet to another. But what we are going to do is face those questions, not shy away, and face them squarely. Welcome, friend, to this intellectual journey. My main aim is to make you think, and think critically. Think for yourself. So whatever your present ideas or philosophies, put on your thinking cap and come search with me. One of the main reasons these debates never come to a satisfying conclusion is because they don't start off with the right foot. And what do I mean by that? The sides and the people involved in the debate do not sit together and decide what it is that will form the base of their discussion. In other words, what are the principles that will guide them? I call them premises. The premises have to set before the debate so that everyone is playing the same game. Otherwise, if they're not set, there is no base, then we are talking past each other, no common bearing, and maybe even playing a different game. So, our first task is to set the premises. And that's why the first session is the premises. And here we begin at the starting point. What is our present position? There are three possible positions. Number one, the attitude of a disbelieving inquirer, the attitude of a believing inquirer, and the attitude of a neutral inquirer. Note that they are all inquirers. In fact, you and I have all three of these attitudes in us. And because they all are inquiring attitudes, we can flit from one to the other so smoothly that we don't even notice the change. So we may come to the table with one attitude and actually do not know that that is the one that we are using at the moment. Thus, we may not be aware of what we are really doing at that point. But what do we mean by these words? Here are some descriptions. The believing attitude dismisses the report prior to thorough investigation. The believing attitude accepts, swallows it before doing any investigation, while the inquiring attitude does not initially accept nor dismiss, but holds verdict until the investigation is done. Here's another three. The disbelieving attitude focuses on the questions and disregards all the fair evidence. The believing attitude will focus on the evidence and disregard all the big questions, whereas the inquiring attitude focuses on the weight of evidence, and that's all he or she can do. Do you know, on this earth, we really cannot have final proofs. What we can have, however, is the weight of evidence. Now, you and I may inquire with a believing or a disbelieving attitude and think we are fair because it's an inquiry. But that is not real true inquiry, because most of us, whenever we delve into this subject, we want to look for evidence that will support our pre-existing stance. It is called confirmation bias. And here's the definition. It is the tendency to recall, select, or interpret evidence in a way that supports one's pre-existing beliefs. Now, how many on earth do you think are biased? Everyone, you, me, everyone on planet Earth is actually biased. So if all of us are biased, don't call anyone biased and don't be called biased by anyone. The challenge really is to become an inquiring inquirer or a neutral inquirer. So how do we shift away from our biases to really becoming neutral? Well, the first thing is to address and deal with confirmation bias. And here's how you do it. A few points. Number one, we confess and acknowledge it. You and I are biased. So what do we do with that? We make a decision that we will not let that enter into our debate. We set it aside. In other words, we drop our previous beliefs and disbeliefs. But really, we can't drop it in a moment. What we mean to say is that we do not rise up in passionate defense of our own beliefs, nor do we attack the beliefs and the points of the opposing side. If we do that, we will avoid blind belief as well as blind dismissal. And then we can engage in neutral inquiry. So what do we mean by neutral inquiry? Here are some points. Number one, a neutral inquirer always makes two opposing theories, never just one. No pros and cons of just this side. No, he makes two opposing theories and then looks at both. Why do we want that? That's to avoid what is called default conclusions. So what do we mean by default? Let me ask you a question. When is a good decision a bad decision? And when is a bad decision a good decision? Oh, you'll say, that sounds contradictory. But really, wait. If you try to answer that, it might be quite insightful. Here's why a good decision is a bad decision. If the options facing you and me are good, better, and best, but we just chose the good. We could have gone for the best, but we chose the good. That's a bad decision. On the other hand, likewise, if the options facing us are bad, worse, and worst, then choosing the bad is a good decision. In fact, of these three, bad, worse, and worst, the bad is the best. Why do we say this? Because in the discussions that we have on these large topics which are controversial, we can never make a good decision. We can only make bad. And what we mean by bad, we mean that all these belief systems and these topics have gaps, discrepancies, and even contradictions. So the question really is, which one would you take? So what we are saying is this. Just because it looks good, don't just grab to that and then discard the others, because the others might be better. And just because this theory has some questions and some discrepancies, don't discard it, because if you discard it, you might go for something worse. In other words, hold on to both the sides and look at both. The next 2 points are that we treat both equally and we give both the same chance to win. Then we can be sure that the real winner has won. And if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of it, then we have to set the criteria that we will use for our search and for our discussion. So let's set the criteria right now. We will lean, number one, on information and evidence, not mere opinion. Number two, we will go for logic and common sense, not crass illogic. And number three, we will strive to reason and explain rather than state some things that are absurd. Socrates said these words, actually quoted by Plato, "Go where the argument leads, Don't lead the argument where you want it to go. Let's say it again. Go where the argument leads. Now, doing that is not all that easy, because facing and addressing big controversial questions actually requires solid, raw courage. Because you might find something there that goes against what you previously believed. And also you might find something there that causes you to change your whole lifestyle and behavior. So even though you choose to become a neutral inquirer, confirmation bias can be really hard to overcome. So we need help. Help in creating an atmosphere that is conducive to being a neutral inquirer right through. So, what shall we do about creating that atmosphere? Here's how we do it. We require 4 factors, 4 things that we will hold on to that will create that atmosphere. Here are the 4. Number 1, humility. Number 2, honesty. Number 3, calmness. And number 4, respect. What do we mean by these words? Humility. This is the cardinal, prime, and most essential factor of all. If ever we become proud and boastful about our own knowledge, we close the door to what we might get next. So we remain humble, teachable, a learning attitude, standing small in the face of the vastness and grandeur of the universe and all the information that it contains. How little we really know. That should make us humble. Also, when there's somebody else next to us who has a lot of knowledge and who obviously is willing to teach, we humbly learn from that individual. Humility is number 1. Honesty. Here's a definition. The willingness to give credit to a point or argument, no matter who brings it to the table, and even if that credit has the possibility of destroying my own previous stand or position. Did you notice that I put my own name there, Subodh Pandit? That is because that is the definition I gave. That is the principle I followed when I was doing my search. In other words, give credit where credit is due, and withhold credit when it is not due. You know what I called it? I called it the wow factor. You got to say wow when a piece of information is really impressive and it amazes you. Don't start first thinking, if I say wow, well, he or she might get the credit and not me. No, that would not be real honesty. Say wow. Are you really willing to say wow? Are you ready to do that? Give credit? Let's check it out. Let's do something to see whether we can respond that way. You know, pi, 22/7, is an irregular number. If you really did that calculation, 22 divided by 7, it would come out to 3.142 and then on and on and on in a very haphazard and arbitrary manner. There is no pattern to those numbers. So what psychologists have said, let's use that series as a test for memory. How many digits can a person memorize and recite? Do you know what the world record is? Most people don't look at that, so you may not know it. Let me tell you, but why don't you have a guess first? What might be the world record? A few years ago it was held by an Indian and then a Japanese, and then I believe the last it went back to an Indian. So the last record that I know of, pi was recited to the 70,000th digit before the first mistake was made. Did you say wow to that? Did you give the credit? If you did, well, we are on the same page. Then we are ready to give credit where credit is due. How about calmness? You know, anger and rage fights your own clear thinking and good judgment, not those of your opponent. So when you're angry, what you say is not exactly what you want to say or what you want to think. Now, sometime during what I say in the next 13 segments, sometimes I will state things that might sound jarring to you. Don't get angry. Don't get upset. Here's what you do. Just say to yourself, I don't agree with that. So the way I'm going to address that is to get a good argument against that so that my argument knocks off his argument. Well, really, that's most welcome. So don't get upset. And how do you get that really good argument to knock off mine? It is to stay calm. Calmness, which is the result of humility and honesty, will give the best chance to you and to me to make those arguments, to form a strong side which will maybe even win over the other side. How about respect? Respect is not agreement, not admiration. We often use it as a synonym for those, but really respect is only giving the others the right to make their own inquiry, their own final decisions, without us looking down our noses at them and even calling them names. No, we uphold their dignity at all times. And we expect them to hold our dignity up for the sake of mutual respect. So we've got to create an atmosphere with these four: humility, honesty, calmness, respect. Now with these we'll get to the big question. I call it the great divide. A, atheism says God is non-existent and fictitious. B, the believing side says God is in existence and factual. Now before we dive into that, there is a question that some people ask. And the question is, do we need God and His existence? Well, why not leave the question completely out? What difference does it make? What difference does it make? Do you know the answer to that can be twofold? Number one, it makes no difference at all. And number two, it makes a huge difference. Both these responses depend on a big if. So here's the first if. If our human lives, let's say 100 years, is the sum total of our existence, what lies beyond is absolute nothingness, total oblivion, then nobody needs God. Do you know that both the sides agree to this? It's just plain common sense. So I'm going to read to you now two statements from each from the other sides. Here's Quentin Smith, an atheist, a confirmed atheist. Look at his words. He wrote this in a book, Theism, Atheism, and the Big Bang Cosmology. The only reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. On the other side, King Solomon, a believer, who wrote out in a religious book these words: "What happens to the fool will happen to me also. The fate of the humans and the fate of animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other." Look, nobody needs God to live or die like a king or a fool. Nobody needs God to live or die like an animal or a human. The other if the supernatural realm is real and God does exist, then a utopia of some kind called a heaven or a paradise or nirvana could be a reasonable theory. And if that is the actual goal of our lives and not what Quentin Smith said, well then you and I will have to agree to at least two things. Number one, we as humans are inherently, totally incapable of getting there. Number two, we need God in this life to show us the path of how to get there. and also to provide for us when we get there. We can't take anything from here to there, so we do need God for that. So finally, do we need God? No, if the supernatural realm is false and fictitious. And yes, absolutely yes, if that realm does exist and reaching there is our goal. So now the pertinent question: is the supernatural realm factual and true? Does God truly exist? Getting into that, here's a challenge. We should not only be fair and balanced in our assessment, but we should make a deliberate attempt to show that we are being even-handed and fair. We should give both sides the same chance to win. Give them all the benefits, and if we are honest, well, take away all the credits that are not supposed to be given. And when we do it fairly, you and I will be sure then that the real winner has won. And then we can give evidence for what we have just found. One of the ways is to implement the PAN process. Now, I'm sure you haven't heard of that PAN process, so let me tell you what it means and what it says. Here's the PAN process. It is a method of inquiry that examines both options equally. What do we mean by that? What does the word PAN mean? Number one, it means going across. So like we said earlier, don't stay on only one side, go across to the others. Like Pan American Airlines, it goes across America. We don't stay at one place. Number two, Pan also means sifting. They panned for gold way back in the 1840s during the gold rush. They took a pan and dipped it into the water and pulled out some rocks and hopefully some nuggets, and the force of the water would take away the lighter rocks and keep the heavier nuggets in the pan. Panning, sifting, choosing the valuable, letting go the ordinary. Pan also happens to be the first three letters of my family name. Now you know where you got that word from, PAN process. I formulated that so that I could use it in my search, so that I could show to myself that I was going to be fair to both the topics, to both the theories, to both the claims. So what does it look like? Here's what it looks like. The PAN process requires 4 columns of arguments. One, a pro, and a second, a con for each of the sides. God exists, God does not exist. Pro and con, 2 columns. A pro and con on this side, another 2 columns, 4 columns. For example, column 1 would be arguments for A, atheism. Column 2, arguments against the believing side, against B. Column 3, arguments for B, for the believing side. And column 4, arguments against A, against the atheistic side. So when you do this, I believe you and I can look at this and we can agree that this is really a very fair process. We are looking at both the sides. And when we do that, we shouldn't try to push down one, should not try to pull up the other. Just let the arguments speak for themselves. So that is what we will do. We will do the PAN process. So now, what have we said so far? The premises have to be set. If we don't set the premises, then our words can fly past one another and we will be at different wavelengths. So we set the premises, and this is what we said the premises would look like. First, we assess our present attitude. Am I a disbelieving inquirer, a believing inquirer, or a neutral inquirer? And then we confess and put aside confirmation bias, our biases, and choose to remain a neutral inquirer, an inquiring inquirer, not a believing inquirer, not a disbelieving inquirer. And then we implement the traits or the characteristics of a neutral inquirer. And what are those? We always look for at least two options, two theories, and we look for the pros and cons of this and the pros and cons of that, meaning we give both the same chance to win. And if we really want to do that, well, then we have to set the criteria. And we set the criteria. You and I did. We will go for evidence, for reason, for logic. Those are the three that will set the criteria. And once we have set the criteria, then we will create an atmosphere that will help us remain in the inquiring mode at all times. It is made up of, number one, humility, number two, honesty, number three, calmness, and number four, respect. With this, we will demonstrate that we will do it fairly by implementing the PAN process, which looks at both the options equally. You know what? We will do the PAN process in the very next section and the segment. So keep coming back, because the next section will talk about the PAN process.
If you have enjoyed this presentation with Dr. Subodh Pandit and wish to watch more of this unique 13-part series for free online, visit the website godfactorfiction.com. That's godfactorfiction.com. If you would like to order this fascinating series on DVD, it is now available from Whitehorse Media. To order from within the U.S., call 1-800-782-4253. Dr. Subodh Pandit has written two eye-opening books entitled Come Search With Me, Does God Really Exist? And Come Search With Me, The Weight of Evidence, which further explore the topics of evolution, theism, atheism, and religion. To order these books from within the U.S., call 1-800-782-4253. That's 1-800-782-4253. If you live outside the U.S., you may also easily order them on Amazon.com.